The first time I looked into the mirror wearing clothes that no one else knew I owned, I didn't see a stranger. I saw someone who had been waiting for me my entire life. I should have taken them off immediately. Instead, I stood there frozen, unable to look away. That single decision changed everything. Within weeks, I was living a secret life that nobody, not my family, not my friends, not even my closest confidant, could have imagined. This isn't just a story about changing clothes. It's the story of how one hidden choice slowly transformed my confidence, my identity, and the way I saw myself forever. The first time I looked into the mirror wearing clothes that no one else knew I owned, I didn't see a stranger. I saw a question I had spent my entire life trying to ignore. I should have taken everything off immediately, folded it away, and pretended none of it had happened. Instead, I stood there in complete silence, unable to look away from my own reflection. That single moment became the first page of a story I never imagined I would live. Growing up, I was the kind of person everyone believed they understood. I played my role well. I laughed when I was expected to laugh, followed the path others thought I should follow, and never gave anyone a reason to think something was different beneath the surface. From the outside, my life looked ordinary. Inside, however, it felt like I was reading the wrong script every single day. There was one object that never judged me: the mirror. No matter how confused I became, it simply reflected whatever stood before it. Over the years, I began treating that mirror almost like a silent friend. Every evening, I would pause in front of it for a few seconds before going to bed, wondering why my reflection always seemed incomplete, as though someone had erased an important detail before I arrived. Those thoughts scared me. I buried them beneath work, hobbies, and endless routines. Whenever they surfaced, I convinced myself they would disappear if I stayed busy enough. Sometimes that worked for days, sometimes only for hours. Then one rainy Saturday changed everything. I ducked into a quiet vintage clothing shop to escape the weather. The place smelled of cedar wood, old books, and freshly brewed tea. It wasn't somewhere I normally would have entered, but the rain gave me an excuse. An elderly woman behind the counter smiled warmly. "Take your time," she said. "Sometimes people don't find what they're looking for until they stop searching." At the time, I thought she was talking about clothes. Now I know she wasn't. I wandered through the narrow aisles without any destination. Jackets, hats, scarves, shoes. Every shelf seemed to belong to another lifetime. Then I noticed it. A simple sky blue cardigan hanging quietly in the corner. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't expensive. For some reason, I couldn't stop staring at it. My heartbeat picked up. I reached toward it before quickly pulling my hand back, glancing around to make sure no one had noticed. Even though nobody was paying attention, I suddenly felt exposed. Why was I nervous? It was only a cardigan, yet touching it felt like opening a door that had been locked inside me for years. The shop owner looked over without saying a word. She didn't smile knowingly. She didn't ask awkward questions. She simply walked over and gently took the cardigan off the hanger. "You have good taste," she said. My face grew warm. It's not for me." She tilted her head with the calmest expression I'd ever seen. "It doesn't have to be," she replied. "But sometimes the things we're drawn to tell us something long before we're ready to listen." Those words followed me all afternoon. Against every instinct telling me to leave it behind, I bought the cardigan. The cashier folded it neatly into a plain paper bag without another comment. Walking home, I felt ridiculous. Every passing stranger suddenly seemed capable of reading my thoughts. Every glance from across the street felt suspicious, even though nobody was looking at me. When I finally reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me and placed the bag on the kitchen table. I didn't open it. Not for an hour. I paced from room to room, trying to convince myself to return it the next morning. Eventually, curiosity defeated fear. I unfolded the cardigan carefully, running my fingertips across the incredibly soft fabric. It felt comforting, gentle, different from anything I had ever owned. I slipped it on over my t-shirt almost absent-mindedly. It fit perfectly, not physically, emotionally. I slowly walked toward the mirror that had witnessed every uncertainty I'd ever hidden. For several long seconds, I simply stood there. Nothing magical happened. The room didn't change. The world outside continued exactly as before, but something inside me became impossibly quiet. For the first time in years, the person looking back didn't seem like someone pretending to exist. The reflection wasn't complete yet, but it finally felt honest. That realization frightened me more than anything ever had. Because once you've seen a glimpse of your authentic self, pretending becomes much harder than telling the truth. That night I barely slept. The cardigan remained folded neatly over the back of my chair, yet it felt as though it was quietly calling my name. Every time I closed my eyes, I found myself standing in front of the mirror again, replaying the expression on my own face. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. Morning arrived with sunlight spilling across my bedroom floor, but the questions from the night before hadn't disappeared. I made coffee, turned on the television, and tried to distract myself. Every few minutes, though, my eyes drifted back toward the cardigan. It was only a piece of clothing, yet somehow it had become a symbol of everything I had spent years trying to silence. Finally, I picked it up again. This time I didn't hesitate. I slipped it on and stood before the mirror. Something unexpected happened. Instead of criticizing myself the way I always had, I found myself smiling just a little. It was small enough that no one else would have noticed. But I noticed. That tiny smile felt more genuine than hundreds I had forced over the years. Over the following weeks, my secret slowly grew. It began innocently enough. A soft scarf, a pair of simple flats that never left the apartment, a light-colored sweater with delicate stitching around the sleeves. None of it felt like pretending. Instead, each new addition felt like uncovering another forgotten piece of a puzzle I hadn't realized I was solving. The mirror remained my quiet witness. Every evening I stood before it for a little longer. At first, I simply admired the colors and fabrics. Then I started paying attention to posture, the way I carried my shoulders, the way I smiled, the way confidence could completely transform a reflection without changing a single feature. I wasn't trying to become someone else. I was discovering how many versions of myself had always existed beneath the surface. Still, the outside world expected the same person it had always known. At work, I laughed at the same jokes. I attended meetings. I chatted about sports I barely followed and television shows I never watched. The conversations felt increasingly distant, as though I were reading lines from a script I'd memorized years ago. One afternoon, while browsing online, I found a local support group for people exploring gender expression through fashion and identity. My finger hovered over the registration button. For nearly 20 minutes. What if someone recognized me? What if I didn't belong? What if I walked in and realized I'd misunderstood everything about myself? The questions came faster than answers. Eventually, I closed my laptop. "I'm not ready," I whispered. But those words echoed differently than they had before. They didn't mean never. They meant not yet. A week later, I opened the page again. This time, before fear could interrupt, I clicked register. Immediately, my heart started racing. There was no taking it back. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday evening. For the rest of the week, every passing day felt longer than the last. Saturday finally arrived. I changed outfits at least 6 times before settling on something simple: a soft lavender sweater, dark jeans, and clean white sneakers. Nothing dramatic. Nothing designed to attract attention. Just enough to feel comfortable. Before leaving, I stood in front of the mirror. The familiar object that had become my silent companion reflected someone who still looked nervous. But there was something new. Hope. I smiled at my reflection. Let's see who we become. The meeting was held in a modest community center tucked between a bookstore and a cafe. My palms were sweating as I reached for the front door. For a brief second, I almost turned around. Then someone opened the door from the inside. A cheerful woman wearing a bright yellow cardigan smiled warmly. "You must be here for the group," she said. I nodded awkwardly. "I'm a little nervous." She laughed softly. So was every single person who walked through this door for the first time. Those words lifted an invisible weight from my shoulders. Inside the room were people of every age and background. Some dressed casually. Some embraced bold, feminine styles. Others simply wore whatever made them feel comfortable. No one stared. No one judged. No one asked me to explain myself. Instead, they welcomed me with smiles that carried quiet understanding. As the evening unfolded, people shared stories about fear, family, confidence, mistakes, and acceptance. Listening to them felt strangely familiar. For the first time in my life, I wasn't wondering whether I belonged. I was wondering why I'd waited so long to find a place where I already did. When the meeting ended, one of the members handed me a small silver keychain shaped like a mirror. "We give one to every newcomer," they said with a smile. "It reminds us that the reflection we fear most is often the one we've been searching for." I closed my hand around the tiny mirror. It was no longer just the mirror in my bedroom guiding me. Now I carried one wherever I went. And somehow, that made the future feel a little less frightening. The little mirror keychain never left my pocket after that evening. Whenever doubt crept into my mind, I would wrap my fingers around it without even thinking. It became more than a piece of metal. It became a reminder that courage didn't arrive all at once. It arrived one small decision at a time. The weeks that followed felt different, not because the world had changed, because I had. For the first time, I stopped treating my interests like secrets that needed to be hidden. Instead of rushing past clothing displays, I allowed myself to look. Instead of pretending certain colors weren't meant for me, I began asking myself a different question. Why not? That simple question became surprisingly powerful. One Saturday afternoon, a few people from the support group invited me to join them for coffee after one of our meetings. My first instinct was to decline. Old habits were difficult to break. What if someone I know sees me? I asked. A woman named Emily smiled knowingly. What if they do? I didn't have an answer. She continued, "You'll spend your whole life preparing for reactions that may never happen. Meanwhile, you'll miss the moments that actually matter." Her words stayed with me. For nearly an hour, we sat together talking, not about labels or expectations, but about everyday life. Favorite books, childhood memories, careers, music, dreams we had postponed for too many years. It struck me that nobody there was trying to become someone extraordinary. They were simply trying to become themselves. That realization changed something deep inside me. Over the following months, my confidence grew in quiet ways. I experimented with softer colors. I learned how different hairstyles could completely change the way I carried myself. I practiced speaking with confidence instead of apologizing for existing. The transformation wasn't about appearance anymore. It was about permission. Permission to stop hiding. Permission to stop measuring my worth against someone else's expectations. Still, not every day was easy. One evening, my older brother called unexpectedly. "We haven't seen you in weeks," he said. "Everything okay?" My heart skipped. "Yeah, just busy. You've been saying that for months." His concern was genuine, and somehow that made the conversation harder. Eventually, he suggested we meet for dinner. The entire week leading up to it, anxiety followed me everywhere. Should I tell him? Should I keep pretending? Every possible outcome played through my mind. Acceptance, confusion, disappointment, silence. When Friday arrived, I almost canceled. Instead, I slipped the tiny mirror keychain into my pocket and reminded myself why it was there. Not to promise perfect outcomes, to remind me that honesty was worth the risk. Dinner began normally. We talked about work, family, the weather, everything except the one conversation I knew was waiting. Finally, he looked at me carefully. "Something's different." I froze. "You seem happier." That wasn't the response I expected. I laughed nervously. "You noticed?" I did. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I took a slow breath. "I've been learning more about myself." He waited quietly. "I've been exploring a more feminine side of who I am." The words felt impossibly heavy as they left my mouth. I expected questions. Instead, he simply nodded. I figured it might be something like that. My eyes widened. "You did. You smiled differently now." I stared at him. That's how I knew. A lump formed in my throat. "I was terrified you'd be disappointed." He leaned back in his chair. "I don't pretend to understand everything," he admitted. "But I'd rather have the real you sitting across from me than a version who's pretending to make everyone else comfortable." I looked down at my hands. Months of fear dissolved in a single sentence. Not every conversation would be this easy. I knew that. Some people wouldn't understand. Others might never accept me. But that evening taught me something invaluable. Acceptance doesn't always arrive with applause. Sometimes it arrives quietly, across a dinner table, in the form of someone choosing to stay. Walking home beneath the city lights, I caught my reflection in a shop window. For the first time, I didn't stop to examine what still needed to change. Instead, I smiled at how far I had already come. The mirror had once shown me uncertainty. Now it reflected possibility. And for the first time in my life, the future looked brighter than the past. There was a time when I believed transformation happened in a single dramatic moment. A grand revelation. A life-changing decision. A point of no return. I couldn't have been more wrong. Real transformation happened quietly. It happened every morning when I chose honesty over fear. It happened every evening when I stopped criticizing the person staring back at me in the mirror. And it happened every time I refused to shrink myself just to fit inside someone else's expectations. Months passed. The support group became more than a monthly meeting. It became family. We celebrated birthdays together, encouraged one another through setbacks, and laughed about the tiny victories that outsiders would never understand. Finding the courage to wear your favorite color in public. Walking into a store without worrying about judgment. Looking into a mirror and smiling instead of searching for flaws. Those moments mattered. They were proof that growth wasn't measured by giant leaps. It was measured by small steps repeated every day. One afternoon, Emily invited me to help organize a community fashion showcase. It wasn't a competition or a performance. It was simply a gathering where people could express themselves through clothing that made them feel authentic. My first reaction was immediate. I can't. She smiled. You said that the first day you walked through our door. I laughed. I remember. And yet here you are. Preparation for the event lasted several weeks. Everyone encouraged one another, exchanged ideas, and celebrated each person's unique style. Nobody was trying to look the same. The goal wasn't perfection. The goal was authenticity. As the showcase approached, I found myself standing before my bedroom mirror more often than ever. But something had changed. Months earlier, I had stood there asking, who am I? Now I asked a different question. How can I become even more myself? The mirror had evolved alongside me. It was no longer a place of doubt. It had become a place of truth. The evening of the showcase finally arrived. The community hall buzzed with quiet excitement. Families filled the audience. Friends chatted warmly. Cameras flashed as people congratulated one another before the event even began. Standing backstage, my heart pounded so loudly I wondered if everyone could hear it. For a brief moment, old fears returned. What if I stumble? What if people laugh? What if I don't belong here after all? Then my hand slipped into my pocket. The tiny mirror keychain was still there. I smiled. It reminded me how far I'd traveled from that frightened person, hiding behind closed apartment doors. Someone called my name. It's your turn. I stepped forward. The lights weren't blinding. The audience wasn't intimidating. In fact, the room felt surprisingly peaceful. I walked slowly, not trying to impress anyone, not trying to prove anything, just walking as myself. When I reached the end of the stage, I looked out across the crowd. Among the smiling faces, I spotted my brother. He stood and applauded first. Then everyone else joined him. The applause wasn't for an outfit. It wasn't for a transformation. It was for the courage to stop pretending. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, I returned to my apartment. The same mirror still hung beside the bedroom window. The same room, the same walls, the same quiet silence. But the person standing before it had changed in ways no photograph could ever capture. I smiled at my reflection, not because everything in life had become perfect. There would still be difficult conversations. There would still be misunderstandings. There would still be days when confidence wavered. But fear no longer controlled the story. Hope did. I reached into my pocket and placed the tiny mirror keychain beside the original mirror on the dresser. One had shown me who I thought I had to be. The other had reminded me who I always had the potential to become. Together, they reflected the greatest lesson of my journey. Transformation isn't about becoming someone new. It's about having the courage to uncover the person who has been patiently waiting beneath the surface all along. And every time I look into a mirror now, I no longer ask whether I recognize the reflection. Instead, I smile and quietly say the words that once felt impossible. Welcome home.